is still a profoundly moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now.
No fanfare, no trumpets, no royal parade through gilded halls, only silence. This was the first sign that something was wrong inside. Buckingham Palace on the evening of October 7, 2025, at exactly 7:00 p.m. the palace gates closed, the flag hung halfway, and the world's oldest monarchy seemed to hold its breath. Reporters outside whispered that the king had not been seen since morning. Courtiers avoided looking at one another. Even the guards, normally standing like statues in red and gold, appeared uneasy. Deep within the palace, lights came on in the blue drawing room, a chamber used only for moments of grave importance, funerals, deaths, and royal confessions. Inside, King Charles III stood alone, no crown, no regalia, just a simple black suit and a single letter in his hand. His reflection glimmered faintly against the glass doors behind him. A ghost caught between duty and despair. Aides waited just beyond the room, unsure if they were about to witness a royal address or a royal ending. When he finally spoke, his words were soft, but carried the weight of centuries. "There comes a time," he said, "when a king must admit he is no longer the man his country needs." The room froze. It was not a rehearsed speech. It was a unraveling. The king's voice trembled, and for the first time in living memory, a British monarch wiped tears from his eyes before the cameras. No one knew what had broken him: pressure, betrayal, illness, or something hidden deeper within the walls of Buckingham Palace. But everyone watching could feel one thing: this was not politics. This was confession, and before the night ended, those words would spark the greatest crisis in the modern monarchy. Stay with me, because what was said behind those locked palace doors at 7:00 p.m. changed royal history forever. Tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. London, New York, Sydney, or somewhere far beyond the shadow of the crown. Hours before the king's tearful statement, Buckingham Palace had already begun to crack from within. It started quietly, as these things always do. Not with scandal or shouting, but with a single envelope, a thick cream-colored file stamped with the insignia of the Royal Archives, arrived at the palace at 2:47 p.m., marked for His Majesty's eyes only. No one but the courier knew its origin. The document was handed straight to the king's private secretary, who paused before delivering it. When Charles opened it, he found a series of memos detailing an internal audit of royal holdings, a routine task, or so it seemed, but the final page bore a signature he had not seen in years. Elizabeth R. It was not a forgery, it was his mother's handwriting. Attached was a handwritten note from 2019 addressed to him personally. It mentioned a contingency collection, a set of historical items, letters and heirlooms stored beyond the reach of the state. Among the documents were references to personal letters between Elizabeth and foreign leaders, a few family relics never catalogued, and something else, something hidden under a black strip of ink labeled Crown Matter Confidential. That hidden section was the spark that started it all. Charles had lived his entire life under his mother's shadow, inheriting both her kingdom and her caution, yet this file suggested she had kept secrets even from him. When he called his private advisor, the man could offer only one explanation: the document had emerged from a secondary archive, discovered during renovations at the Palace of Holyrood in Edinburgh. The archivists had assumed it was routine, but it was not. For 2 hours, Charles sat in silence in his private study, the file open in front of him. He read his mother's note over and over, trying to understand its meaning. The phrase that haunted him most was simple but devastating: "The truth, when buried too long, becomes inheritance." At 5:20 p.m., he requested a full briefing from the head of royal security within the hour. Reports arrived, classified documents, showing that certain valuable heirlooms and letters had indeed been removed from the royal collection decades ago, quietly moved to private estates for safekeeping. The files confirmed what tabloids had long whispered: there were still items missing from the Queen's personal inventory, including some rumored to have been last seen at Ray Millhouse, Camilla's private estate. The revelation hit him like a blow. For months, Charles had fought to unify a divided family and a weary public. Now the ghosts of old secrecy had returned to threaten his reign. Every instinct told him to keep it buried, to follow the old royal creed: never complain, never explain. But another voice inside, the one that remembered his mother's disappointment during his youth, said this was exactly what had poisoned the monarchy for generations. He poured a glass of whiskey and looked up at the towering portrait of Elizabeth above his desk. Her painted eyes seemed to ask a single question: would he be the one to finally tell the truth? At 6:05 p.m. Charles called an emergency meeting of his inner circle. 5 advisors, 1 chaplain, and Princess Anne. No cameras, no Camilla, no William. The room was dim, the curtains drawn. "This cannot stay hidden," he said flatly, placing the file on the table. "We must reveal everything that was kept from the crown. Agnes's reaction was immediate. "You'll destroy the institution," she said. Charles' voice was calm, but final than it deserves. To be destroyed, that was when he made his decision, not resignation, not abdication, something deeper, a public reckoning live from Buckingham Palace. He would confess not his sins but the sins of secrecy that had haunted them all. By 6:47 p.m., the broadcast room was being prepared. The staff did not know what kind of statement they were about to record, but as the king adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, one thought pulsed in his mind, relentless and clear: the crown was never meant to hide the truth. The sun had already slipped behind the palace walls by the time cameras were set up inside the blue drawing room. The chandeliers glowed softly against the fading light, casting long shadows across gold trim and faded portraits. This was the room where monarchs were meant to look immortal, timeless, untouchable. But that evening, the room felt smaller, and the man at its center appeared all too human. King Charles stood without his crown, without his robes, only a simple black suit and a white pocket square. To those watching live, it seemed he had shed not only the symbols of power but perhaps the will to carry them. The audience outside the palace gates had no idea what they were about to witness. At exactly 7:30 p.m., the cameras started rolling. The king's private secretary gave a single nod, and for a moment there was only silence. So deep that even the faint ticking of the antique clock seemed to echo through the air. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was low, almost fragile. "For many years, I have carried this responsibility with devotion and humility, but tonight, I must speak not as your king but as a man who has reached the limits of what duty can demand." The words were simple, but their weight fell like stones. The advisors watching from behind the camera exchanged uneasy glances. No one, not even Princess Anne, knew the exact words he had prepared. He continued, "The crown, as you know it, has been built upon centuries of silence. It has survived wars, loss and betrayal by pretending pain does not exist, but pain does exist, and so does truth." There was a pause long enough for viewers to lean closer to their screens. Then Charles drew a deep breath. "I have learned that some truths buried for too long do not die quietly. They find ways to rise through us, through history, through the very walls of this palace. Tonight, I cannot continue to serve while that silence remains unbroken." The words struck like a crack of thunder in the press room. Journalists gasped outside. The crowd murmured in disbelief across the country. Living rooms fell silent as the BBC banner read, "Breaking King Charles addresses nation." Charles looked down briefly, then straight into the camera, his eyes wet but steady. "This is not a moment of shame, but of reckoning. The monarchy must no longer be a shield for secrets. And if stepping aside is what it takes to restore trust, then I do so willingly, with love, not resentment." There it was, the word no one expected. Step aside. The control room froze. Advisors signaled to cut the feed, but the king raised his hand, telling them to let him finish. "I know this news will bring uncertainty. Some will say I am abandoning my duty. Others will understand that duty, when done too long, begins to consume the man who carries it. I do this not to weaken the crown but to save it." He paused again, exhaling, as if he had held that truth for decades. Outside the palace gates, cameras flashed and crowds pressed forward, straining to hear. Across the world, in New York, Paris, Sydney, Manila, people were glued to screens, watching a man who was once the most untouchable person in Britain break his own silence. "I want to ask you something as you watch this unfold. If you were in his place, bound by duty, haunted by legacy, would you have had the courage to walk away? Tell me what you think in the comments, and let me know where you are watching from. It's always fascinating to see how people from different countries view the crown. Some see power, others see burden. Decide what this means. For me, it is simply the end of one life and the beginning of another." Then he stepped back from the microphone. The cameras cut, the lights dimmed, and for the first time in 75 years, the blue drawing room fell completely silent. What came next would not just shake the walls of Buckingham, but the very idea of monarchy itself. The cameras stopped rolling at 7:28 p.m. The blue drawing room, moments earlier a stage for history, now felt like a crypt. The crew began packing their equipment in uneasy silence, their faces pale from what they had just witnessed. The king had spoken for less than 20 minutes, but his words had already spread like wildfire across the world. When the last cameraman left, Charles remained where he stood, staring at the empty chairs where his advisors had been seated. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and nerves. The portraits of past monarchs loomed above him: Victoria, George V, Elizabeth II, each painted in the prime of authority, each now an accusation. For the first time since childhood, he felt utterly alone. A door creaked open behind him. Princess Anne stepped in, her heels muffled against the carpet. She closed the door softly and said nothing for several seconds, then quietly, You know what this means, don't you? Charles didn't look up. I imagine I do. They'll twist it, they'll say it was weakness. He smiled faintly, but it did not reach his eyes. They always do. Anne walked closer, her face still though, her voice betrayed emotion. Mother never wanted this. She believed the monarchy should bend, but never break. He finally turned to her eyes, red-rimmed. Then perhaps she was wrong. For a long moment, there was nothing but the steady hum of the chandeliers. Then in a voice almost broken, he added, I've spent my entire life trying to be her idea of a king, but I was never built for this world of marble and mirrors. Agnes' expression softened. You were built for something more fragile. He gave a bitter laugh. And that's the crime, isn't it, to feel too much? He sank into one of the velvet chairs, rubbing his temples. I thought I could carry it. I thought I could be the bridge between tradition and truth, but all I've done is stand still, while the world moved on. Anne hesitated before placing a hand on his shoulder. The crown will survive this. It always does. Charles shook his head. Maybe it shouldn't. Before she could respond, Camilla entered, her face drawn and pale, her eyes searching the room. She had been watching the broadcast from another chamber, unseen by the public, surrounded by aides, who did not know whether to comfort or avoid her now. She looked at her husband as though seeing him for the first time. You actually said it, she whispered. You told them. Charles met her gaze. I had to. Her composure cracked. You think honesty will save you and asked it, want it, never does. An S stiffened. But Charles' voice remained calm. It might not save me, but it might save what's left of us. Camilla stepped closer, her voice trembling. You've exposed every weakness this family tried to hide. They'll tear us apart for it. He looked at her sadly. They already have. For a brief heartbreaking moment, neither spoke. The sound of rain against the palace windows filled the silence. Then quietly Camilla said, You've always carried too much weight on your shoulders, but this was supposed to be ours. Charles rose slowly, taking her hands in his. I carried it for both of us, but I can't anymore. The words broke her composure. Her lips trembled. Then what happens now? He released her hands gently, almost reverently. Now we face what we've built and what we've lost. Outside the door, aides whispered urgently. The world beyond Buckingham was erupting. Protesters had gathered outside the gates, holding candles and banners that read, Long live the truth and the people's monarchy. Others demanded his immediate abdication, their voices echoing across the mall. William had arrived minutes earlier and was being briefed by his advisors. He wanted to see his father but was told to wait. He didn't. He burst into the room, unannounced, still in his evening coat. You could have warned me, he said coldly. Charles turned to face him. If I had, would it have changed anything? William's eyes burned with anger. You've jeopardized everything, the trust, the institution, the future. Charles' voice stayed measured. The institution will survive, it always does, but if it survives without honesty, then it survives as a lie. Honesty doesn't keep nations together. William shot back. Leadership doesn't. Stepped between them, her tone cutting. Enough, this isn't the time. But Charles' next words silenced them both. This isn't about the monarchy, it's about the man beneath it, and I'm done pretending he doesn't exist. No one spoke. Rain drummed harder against the windows. Camilla turned away, clutching a handkerchief, and crossed her arms, hiding her tears. William stood frozen, torn between fury and pity. Then Charles walked to the window and looked out at the gathering crowd below. Thousands of flickering lights beneath the gray London sky. Look at them, he murmured. They don't need a king. They need a conscience. Anne whispered, You've given them both tonight. He didn't answer. His reflection in the glass showed a man stripped of regalia, stripped of defense. Just a father, a husband, and a soul trying to breathe beneath the weight of a golden crown. When the bells of Westminster struck 8, the world outside kept roaring. But inside the blue drawing room, King Charles stood motionless, the tears had fought finally slipping free. And for the first time in 75 years, Britain's monarch wept not for duty but for freedom. By dawn, London felt heavier, as if the air itself were mourning. The rain had not stopped since the king's speech, and the grey light breaking over Buckingham Palace did little to ease the tension hanging over the city. Every news channel in the world broadcast the same headline: King Charles steps aside, monarchy in crisis. Outside the palace gates, crowds grew by the hour. Some came to show support, others to demand accountability. They brought candles, flags, handwritten letters, and photographs of the late Queen Elizabeth II. Someone even played the national anthem on a violin, its trembling notes swallowed by the wind. But this was not the jubilant crowd of a coronation. It was a nation unsure whether to grieve or applaud. Across the Atlantic, the White House released a carefully worded statement expressing respect for His Majesty's personal decision. The Commonwealth countries scrambled for direction. In Canada and Australia, questions erupted overnight. What did this mean for their own constitutional ties? Could the monarchy still lead a world it no longer seemed to understand? Inside Buckingham, the royal household was in chaos. Advisors moved like ghosts through corridors whispering updates that no one wanted to hear. One aide described it as the quietest panic in royal history. The king's personal secretary tried to manage the global press storm, but the calls were endless. Meanwhile, in a private wing of the palace, Camilla sat in silence. The television flickered with endless commentary, pundits dissecting every word, every tear, every breath of her husband's address. They called it a moment of reckoning, a calculated retreat, a royal implosion, but no one saw the woman sitting alone in a blue silk robe, staring at the ring on her finger, and always pragmatic, had taken charge of the crisis meetings. "We have to act fast," she told the assembled advisors. "Either we frame this as transition, or we lose control of the story." Transition to what? Someone asked. Anne looked toward the window where the Union Jack hung limp against the rain. "To the next chapter," she said. Whether we like it or not, that next chapter had already begun. At 10:15 a.m., Prince William arrived through a side entrance of Buckingham Palace, avoiding the press cameras. Caught a brief glimpse of him walking briskly under an umbrella, his expression hard. Rumors spread instantly. Was he preparing to take the throne? Would his father's decision a coronation no one expected so soon? When William entered the king's private study, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Charles was seated at his desk, still wearing yesterday's black suit. A pile of handwritten letters from citizens lay unopened. Beside him, he looked up, weary but calm. "Have you come to lecture me or to listen?" Charles asked quietly. William hesitated. "I came to understand." Charles gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Then sit, because understanding is what I failed to offer, my mother, and what I refused to deny you." There was a long pause before William spoke again. "You've left the country in shock. People are scared. They think this is the end of everything." "It's not the end," Charles said softly. "It's the beginning of truth." William frowned. "Truth doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't hold the Commonwealth together." "No," Charles replied, "but lies don't hold it forever." Either the younger man sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The people need stability, father. If you walk away, I'll have to take the crown sooner than anyone expected." "Then take it," Charles said. His voice was steady but kind. "But take it for them, not for the institution. Lead differently. Lead as yourself." William studied him for a long moment. "And what about you? Will still be here," Charles said, glancing toward the window, "just no longer above them. Perhaps for once I can finally be among them." Outside, the crowds chanted his name, not in protest, not in adoration, something in between. It was the sound of a nation reeling, unsure whether it had just lost a monarch or gained a man. News reports replayed his final line from the broadcast, "I do this not to weaken the crown but to save it." Analysts debated its meaning. Did he plan to abdicate formally or simply withdraw from public life? The palace remained silent. And yet, despite the confusion, something remarkable was happening. Letters and messages began flooding in from around the world, thousands of them from people thanking him for being vulnerable, for being human. One message, written by a young girl from Glasgow, read simply, "Thank you for showing us that even kings can cry." By afternoon, Charles read that line aloud to his advisors, his voice breaking again. "That," he said, "is the monarchy I wanted to build." As the day ended, the rain eased and the clouds over London parted briefly. A faint ray of sunlight touched the palace balcony where his mother once waved to millions. Charles stood there now, not as king but as man. And for the first time it seemed the crown, however fractured, might finally feel real again. The evening of October 8, 2025, arrived like a slow exhale. The storm clouds that had blanketed London since the king's address began to thin, revealing streaks of fading sunlight over Buckingham Palace. The mood inside, however, was far from calm. The monarchy stood at the edge of transformation, and every person within those walls knew it. The royal household was preparing for what aides delicately called the signing. It would be the first time since Edward VII in 1936 that a British sovereign would formally step back from the throne, but this time there was no scandal, no abdication for love, no exile. This was something quieter, more deliberate. King Charles III would remain king in name, but relinquish his daily powers to the heir Prince William. At 9:15 p.m., a group of senior ministers, members of the Privy Council, and the Archbishop of Canterbury gathered inside the green drawing room a few doors down from where the historic broadcast had been made the night before. The room glowed with candlelight, its air dense with tradition and disbelief. Charles entered without ceremony. Gone was the stoic royal composure of his youth. His steps were slower, his posture heavy but resolute. He took his place at the mahogany table, where the royal documents waited, the top page embossed with the crest of the House of Windsor. Across from him, William stood in full military dress, his expression unreadable. The Archbishop cleared his throat softly. "Your Majesty, the Council recognizes This act is one of will not of compulsion. Are you prepared to proceed? Charles nodded. Once I am. He reached for the pen, pausing only briefly before signing his name, Charles R. The scratch of ink against parchment echoed through the chamber, followed by the clicking of the clock on the mantel. When the signature was complete, he set the pen down and looked to his son. It's yours now, he said quietly. William didn't speak, he simply bowed his head for several seconds. No one moved, the silence was reverent, almost sacred. Then, the Archbishop stepped forward, handing William the document that formally appointed him Prince Regent, a title granting him authority to act on behalf of the crown. The monarchy had not fallen, but it had changed forever, and was the first to break the stillness. The line continues, she said softly, her voice half proud, half resigned. Charles gave her a faint smile, as it must. The ceremony ended without applause, without anthem, without spectacle. Those who attended later described it as the quietest revolution in British history. Later that night, Charles walked alone through the palace courtyard. The lamps cast soft pools of light on the cobblestones, and in the distance, Big Ben chimed 10. He stopped at the edge of the fountain, staring at his reflection rippling in the water. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about duty, reputation, or legacy, only peace. He removed his signet ring and turned it slowly in his hand. The gold gleamed under the lamplight, engraved with the royal crest that had marked every monarch before him. Then almost gently he placed it in his pocket inside the palace. William was already being briefed by aides. He would face the nation at dawn to deliver a message of unity and continuity. Camilla, meanwhile, prepared to leave Buckingham for their private residence in Wiltshire, choosing silence over spectacle. As Charles made his way back through the courtyard, a group of palace staff stood respectfully at a distance. When he passed, they bowed, not out of protocol but gratitude. He nodded slightly, his voice barely audible, as he murmured, the crown endures, but tonight it finally breathes. And somewhere beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace, the people of Britain, whether they cheered, wept, or simply watched in awe, understood that they had witnessed not the fall of a king but the rebirth of a man. The following morning London awoke to a strange calm. The sky was pale gold, and for the first time in days the rain had stopped outside Buckingham Palace. The crowds remained, but the anger had softened into quiet reflection. A monarchy had not ended, it had evolved. King Charles was no longer the man the world had known. The crown still bore his name, but the burden had lifted. He spent that morning not in a gilded chamber but walking through the gardens alone, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. The roses had begun to bloom again, stubbornly, even after the storm. He paused near a marble bench, where his mother once sat during her final summer. For a long time, he said nothing. Then with a small smile, he whispered, it's lighter now. That moment, simple, human, unguarded, captured what his reign had come to mean. It wasn't about titles, wealth, or ceremonies. It was about the courage to let go when holding on becomes too heavy. For decades he had been the man waiting to be king, only to learn that the truest form of leadership is knowing when to step back and let others rise. Perhaps that's the lesson this story leaves us with. Power doesn't make a person great, self-awareness does. Sometimes the strongest thing a leader can do is to admit they are still human, still flawed, still learning. As William prepared to step forward into a new age of the monarchy, Charles turned away from the palace gates. No crown upon his head, no anthem to follow, just the quiet dignity of a man who had finally made peace with himself. And now I want to ask you, if you were in his place, faced with history, family and duty, would you have found the strength to walk away? Tell me what you think in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. If this story moved you, give it a like, share it with someone who believes in honest leadership, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold royal stories every week. The next one might change how you see the crown forever.